So we're speaking here with Andy Shaw, and it's November 6th, a few days after the election. You just saw Governor-elect Bruce Rauner. Tell me, really, give me your gut. Were you surprised that this guy beat Quinn?
I wasn't surprised. I think the voters in Illinois, like voters around the country, were looking for change, and Illinois has had a lot of problems in recent years, and at the end of the day, voters blamed Governor Quinn for those problems, and they decided to give someone else a chance. Bruce Rauner promised change, and now they want him to deliver it.
I mean, there's been no change. They didn't pick up at any House seats, so therefore, if there's a veto, as you know, if the Democrats hang together in the House, they can override. They can easily do so in the Senate. Is that a major barrier to any real change here in the next 4 years, or at least the next 2?
Well, you're suggesting that the Democratic majorities in the House and the Senate are automatically going to oppose Bruce Rauner because he's Republican. I don't agree with that. I think that Madigan and Cullerton are going to try to work closely with Bruce Rauner to solve the problems of the state of Illinois so long as it doesn't jeopardize their Democratic majorities. And so I think they're going to try to help him do good things, but if those things are painful, they want him to wear the jacket rather than their members. That's how it always works. They did the pension bill, which was anathema to many of their members, and of course none of them paid the price. Maybe in part Pat Quinn did. So my point is, I think Madigan and Cullerton will take a good faith approach to Bruce Rauner, try to work with him on things they agree with, and if they're painful, they'll hope that he takes the political heat and not them.
Okay, January 1, as you know, the income tax increase that went from 3% to 5% 4 years ago will automatically partially sunset. It'll go back from 5% to 3.75% if nothing is done before January 1 by the state legislature. Do you think nothing will be done and that tax rate will go back to 3.75% on January 1, 2015?
By all indications, the legislature is going to do nothing during the veto session. The tax will roll back by about 60% of that increase. It'll punch a $3 or $4 billion hole in the budget. And John Cullerton, the Senate president, has made it very clear they're expecting Bruce Rauner to propose the solution to that problem in his budget. They will wait for him to propose a solution, and then they'll react. The point being that the tax is going to drop. There'll be a hole in the budget, and their argument is going to be he's the governor, he proposes the budget, let's see what his fix looks like, and then we'll deal with it.
Okay, so for 30 years or more, Andy Shaw, who's now CEO and president of the Better Government Association, he was really the smartest guy in Illinois state politics. Everybody knows that. So what would you advise Bruce Rauner to do regarding taxes?
I would advise Bruce Rauner to assemble the best and the brightest in business, labor, civic community, the academic community, and of course the political world. Sit around a table and look at the tax rates here in Illinois, look at the tax rates in states that have better records on job creation and growth, and try to figure out what a fair approach to tax policy is. The biggest mistake that was made in this last session was all of these piecemeal approaches to taxes. Mike Madigan wanted the millionaire's tax. Don Harmon wanted the progressive tax. Pat Quinn wanted to continue with the income tax. There was talk about tax credits for business. There were multiple tax proposals. But no one ever suggested putting everybody around a table, looking at tax rates, looking at spending, and deciding what is fair to both business and individuals. Illinois is long overdue for tax reform, but it has to be done intelligently, not on a piecemeal basis, not a referendum that says if you make $1 million, you pay 3% more, it's going to education. That may be a good idea, but standing by itself, it's ridiculous. A good tax policy is comprehensive and fair, and that can only be accomplished if a group of people sit down together. So if I'm Bruce Rauner, I don't simply dictate tax policy. I bring smart people together from all the sectors and let them come up with a recommendation, and then if I can live with it, I try to sell it.
Now, you know many of these folks. Who would you suggest for 4 or 5 names that might be good to be advising Mr. Rauner, as you suggested, on tax policy?
I don't think it's that complicated. I think you take Lawrence Massal from the Civic Federation and Tom Johnson, who used to be for the Taxpayers Federation. I think you get somebody from labor who's reasonable, maybe the head of the Illinois AFL-CIO, or Jorge Ramirez here in Chicago. Get somebody from the Harris School at the U of C who's an expert on public policy. Maybe get another person from a civic organization. Then you get a couple folks from the state legislature, maybe the budgeteers from the General Assembly. Arm them with all the data from Illinois and other states, and then spend a couple days or longer if necessary. These are critical decisions about the future. We've never taken an intelligent approach to this or any other aspect of Illinois finances, and that's why we're in such a desperate mess.
Now, Mr. Rauner is said to be conservative. As you know, there are two major conservative think tanks here, and you've been on the panel with one of them, two major conservative think tanks here in Illinois, and that's John Tillman heading up the Illinois Policy Institute, Joe Bass heading up the Heartland Institute. Would you suggest both those individuals be on this high-level committee you're talking about?
Oh, absolutely, and I apologize. I should have mentioned John Tillman and the Illinois Policy Institute. I'm not familiar with Mr. Bass. I think the best and the brightest from all of the ideological points on the spectrum. John is an expert, and he certainly belongs at that table, along with Lawrence Massal and a lot of others. I would make sure you have a real bipartisan group that represents the right, the left, and the center, because then I think you can have a vigorous debate. Whether you can come up with an agreement, I'm not sure, but at least you ought to try.
Now, if you had a guess, the tax rate they would come up with would not be to go back to the old level, I don't think, which would be 5%, nor to go all the way down to the sunset level of 3.75. Somewhere in between, would you say maybe like 4.5, 4.6, at least for the first year?
I'm not a tax expert, so it's impossible for me to say. I would say this, however. I wouldn't talk in the abstract about one tax, the income tax. I would look at property taxes. I would look at sales taxes. I would look at user fees. I'd look at the whole mix of revenues that fund a state, and I would try to figure out what is fair to everybody so that the burden doesn't fall on the homeowners disproportionately, or the small businesses, or the corporations, or the millionaires necessarily. In a perfect world, those with the better ability to pay should pay more, but it's not a perfect world. You have to compromise and come up with something everyone can live with, and I don't know what the answer is on the exact rate of the income tax, because I think, as Rauner said when asked that question, it has to be part of a mix. It's the same question about the minimum wage. Obviously, everybody should make more, but not if they lose their job because they're making more. That's why he's suggesting that the minimum wage increase be linked with a lot of other reforms that grow jobs and grow the economy. Now, that it's easier said than done, but it's a good concept, because you don't want to throw people out of work because companies can't afford to pay the higher minimum wages, and in some cases that could happen.
And Mr. Rauner said if he had something to say about it, and I guess he might, if there is going to be an increase in the minimum wage, he wants to be done, as you say, in a context of making Illinois competitive. And I asked him, and he said to him, making them competitive means workman's comp reform and tort reform. Would you agree with Mr. Rauner on that?
Well, that is a Republican ideological position, and we are nonpartisan and apolitical, so I'm not going to say I agree with him. I appreciate where he's coming from. He has a concept of what competition is about and what makes it work. I'm sure that some of the union folks and some of the Democrats would have a different point of view. So I think it's his job as the governor-elect to lay out his position, to listen to what Mr. Madigan and Mr. Cullerton have to say, and at the end of the day, most importantly, try to find common ground. Try to find some place in the middle. Here's the good thing about the Rauner election. You can like him or dislike him. You can think of him as a robber baron or a ruthless, cutthroat private equity guy. But he has been negotiating deals his entire adult life. He's been buying and selling companies. He's been reading balance sheets. That's a lot of government. A lot of government is balance sheets. That's budgets. It's a lot of negotiations. That's what happens in the legislature. I think he's very well equipped for the give and take and the conversation necessary, and that's what I hope he can really use his skills to bring about. Look, Madigan and Cullerton are like negotiating partners, and I think that it's going to be an interesting thing to see. They are expert negotiators, and so is he. They want to reach conclusions, and that's what I hope they do.
Okay, but you did say you are head of the Better Government Association, and so better government deals with policy, even if you're nonpartisan. And as you know, there have been a lot of goo-goos, good government reformers, who have said we need to modernize our tax system in Illinois. And as you know, we don't really tax services. So Mr. Rauner, during the campaign, talked about taxing some of those services, and he was really hit by Quinn. He said, "Oh, that's going to be terrible. You're going to really hurt the low-income guy." So stepping back, since you are the head of the Better Government Association and you do deal with policy, I know you want to weed out public corruption, but it goes further, doesn't it?
Well, of course. All I can say about that is, yes, we deal deeply in policy. Our investigations suggest reforms that we push really hard in Springfield. And I will say that one of the things that Bruce Rauner has to do to fulfill a campaign pledge is to fight corruption, fight conflicts of interest, lobbying, abuse, and things like that, the excessive units of government. Those are all things that we believe deeply in. When it comes to tax policy, however, our organization takes a very simple position. Let's have a vigorous public debate about this. Let's be transparent about it, and let's come up with good solutions. I'm not saying that we should have service taxes versus income taxes. I'm saying let's have a good conversation without demagoguing the issue, and let's try to basically look at the data and figure out what is part of a fair tax package. Sorry about the cell phone.
No, this is cinema verite. Okay. Our viewers will understand. We're out there with the people, right,
sure.
Andy? No, so I understand you want to be open, you can look at things, but if you had, you did spend 30 years in this stuff before
right.
You went to the BGA. You do have some opinions.
I have lots of opinions, but I do not.
I'm not speaking on behalf of the BGA now. Let me speak to you as Andy Shaw.
No, I speak on behalf of the BGA with the cameras on.
Okay. We'll take it that way. Speaking on as head of the BGA, sure. Do you think if you were advising Rauner, you ought to take a good look at what he was talking about, that is some tax on services, because if so much of your economy in Illinois across the country comes from services, and if you don't tax services, you only tax hard output, that doesn't seem to make sense. And I think you could find a number of good economists, bipartisan, who would say that as well. See my point?
Of course.
We can maybe get an answer from you here.
No, I totally see your point, and I can only tell you what I've read and heard, which is that the whole tax structure of Illinois was put together when we were essentially a manufacturing economy. We are no longer a manufacturing state like we used to be. We have become a financial services economy. We have become a services economy.
Right.
And so for a governor-elect to suggest that we start looking at where the incomes, where the revenues actually are generated and come from, that makes perfect sense. I don't know if that's tax equity. It makes sense to have the conversation, and so I think we welcome the conversation, but I'm not an economist and I'm not a tax expert, so I don't know what the right mix is. I do know that it's healthy to suggest alternatives, to suggest modernization, and then I think that people who do know the specifics of this, I'm not one of them, they ought to sit down and hammer out reasonable solutions.
Okay. Would you agree, on the state level, the main drivers of spending are pensions, pension benefits for state employees, education, and Medicaid? Those three things, would you agree, are the main guts of the general revenue budget for the state of Illinois?
Absolutely, and Governor Quinn argued that they did Medicaid reform. He argues that they did workers' comp reform. They argue that they've funded education and tried to build in more accountability. What I would say is you just have to basically keep vigilant at all times and make sure that the Medicaid dollars go to the people who need them and they're not fraudulently handed out, that education goes to educate kids in classrooms and not pay for bureaucrats. One of the great sins in the Chicago Public Schools has always been this: 50 cents on every dollar went for administration, not into the classroom. That's absurd. 3/4 of the education budget ought to pay for the teachers who teach the kids. So that's true at all levels of government. We have to pay for the services. That would be the cops on the street and the firefighters and all that. But we don't necessarily have to pay for all the bureaucrats who work behind desks and basically support those people. In many cases, they're excessive and unnecessary. And that's why I hope one thing Bruce Rauner does is look department by department and figure out what is actually a service and what's a bureaucratic excess.
Now, there was major pension reform legislation that passed and was signed by Governor Quinn, and that dealt in large part with the cost of living adjustment, modifying that, the so-called COLA, also raising the retirement age for state employees, also raising, I believe, the employee contribution. And as you know, the Supreme Court, the state Supreme Court, has ruled recently on an analogous case that has led many people to say the state Supreme Court is likely to rule that legislation that passed, that reform legislation for pensions, unconstitutional. If that happens, how would you advise Rauner to deal with that? Governor Rauner.
I don't really have to advise him. He's already told us what he wants to do. He would like to shift to a 401k style plan going forward. So in a Rauner world, you would basically lock in all the benefits currently earned by every state employee, and you wouldn't be cutting anyone's benefits. But going forward, everyone would be shifted to a defined contribution, no longer a defined benefit. That's his plan. That tends to be anathema to Democrats and to unions, and of course that's not the sort of thing that Mr. Madigan and Mr. Cullerton are going to be wholeheartedly in support of. So Rauner has to make his case. Why is that economically sound? Why is it fair to public employees? He could also decide to basically tweak the pension bill that was passed a year ago. But I think we have to wait and see what the courts do. This case is still at the circuit court level in Sangamon County. We don't know how the judge is going to rule in Sangamon County, let alone what they're going to do at the Supreme Court level. And a conversation I had with Attorney General Lisa Madigan led me to believe that the cases are not necessarily analogous, and just because they found the health issue unconstitutional doesn't mean they're automatically going to take the same approach to the pension. So let's see what the lower court does. Let's see what the Supreme Court does. And that gives Mr. Rauner a lot of time to publicly support an approach and then try to sell it to the legislature, unless he chooses to wait until after the Supreme Court decision.
Let's go over to education. A major chunk of the state budget is kindergarten through 12th grade, also to a lesser extent, but still significant, higher education. A lot of people, as you know well, Mayor Rahm Emanuel has pushed for charter schools, in part, I believe, because he thinks it improves by giving people choice. It helps especially people in low-income minority areas where schools are not performing as well as other areas. Mr. Rauner has gone further. He said today he'd like to lift the caps on charter schools. Sounds like an expansion of the number of charter schools. And he said he'd also like to give some parents in those areas, where, especially where they're not performing well, give them choice in the form of scholarships and school vouchers. Or vouchers. Again, you're not taking a specific position, but you folks do deal with, it is the Better Government Association. Government is involved in schools. Do you think that makes sense to you as head of the BGA, that we ought to do more to give parents, empower parents, especially in low-income minority areas where schools are not performing well? Give them choice in terms of charter schools. Give them choice in terms of school vouchers.
Well,
what sayeth you, Andy Shaw, head of the head of the BGA?
Well, I'll tell you, we had 2 idea forums on the issue of charter schools, and they produced a lot of really interesting information. And one of the bottom line facts that can't be argued with is there's no clear indication that charter schools are appreciably better than public schools, and there's no indication that vouchers automatically give a kid a good education. I would say what I would say about anything like this. Put this into a bill and argue its merits in the General Assembly and let the chips fall where they may. Reverend Meeks, who was a state senator, is on Rauner's transition team. He was a strong proponent of charter schools and a strong proponent of vouchers when he was in the General Assembly. He tried to get the Democratic majorities in the House and the Senate to go along. They refused. So it's Mr. Rauner's right and perhaps obligation to raise the issue again. I'm not going to say that's good, bad, or indifferent. As a parent of 3 and a grandparent of 4, what I would say is yes, every child is entitled to a good education funded with public dollars. The form it takes, I don't know which is better. I will tell you, we did one of our good government spotlights on Lindblom High School, which used to be a gem on the South Side, fell into disrepute and gang influence, and as a gem once again. The principal at Lindblom was given a Golden Apple Award or a couple awards for basically recreating and revitalizing that school. That is a public school. So charters, magnets, parochials, privates are not panaceas. A good school needs a good principal and a good staff and involve parents. And so, you can have that in the worst neighborhood, you can have it in the best neighborhood. So make the proposals and argue them out, look at the facts, and then make reasonable decisions. I'm not going to try to dictate which of the legislation.
What I'm hearing then is that As you may know, John Tillman at the Illinois Policy Institute, Joe Bast at the Heartland Institute, Andrew Broy, head of the Illinois Network of Charter Schools, they all argue they see the evidence different from you. They do think that the evidence shows that charter schools do outperform traditional neighborhood schools, and they also think school vouchers were tried, which has not been in great many areas, do outperform traditional neighborhood schools. Are you, as head of the BGA, open to looking at that evidence, listening to these folks, and seeing if, as this gets hashed out, perhaps they're right. Perhaps charter schools and voucher schools do outperform and therefore should be encouraged by you folks at the BGA?
Well, we've already, as an organization, looked at the data, and some studies do indicate that charters perform better. Some studies indicate that vouchers do well. But there are others that say just the opposite. All I would say is that the research is inconclusive. But that's neither here nor there. The point is that this is a public policy discussion that public officials have to get engaged in. It's the job of the legislature to pass the laws. All I can say as head of the BGA is have a vigorous discussion about it. Don't dismiss it wantonly, and don't simply pass it cavalierly. Take up these issues and argue them in your hearings and in your chamber. The obligation of the General Assembly, like the City Council and the Cook County Board, is to take public policy issues seriously and have conversations about them and try to make intelligent decisions. One of the big shortcomings of government at all levels is a failure to properly analyze issues, study them, and have hearings on them. There's either a rush to judgment in one direction or the other, or no action at all. So Rauner has a lot of ideas. Some are controversial. Let's give them all a vigorous public discussion and have votes in the General Assembly, and let the people we elect to make the decisions make those decisions. They don't need Andy Shaw to tell them what to do.
Now, we just had a gubernatorial campaign that from the primary extended to 7 or 8 months. Before the primary, there was a lot of discussion. Certainly, I think most people would say after the primary, after it was the matchup of Quinn and Rauner, the campaigns, the public heard very little public policy discussion. They heard a lot of negative ads on both sides, and indeed in the debates by Channel 7, by the other sponsors, they kind of degenerated into each candidate, no matter what they were asked, throwing at each other sort of a negative ad. Would you agree with that assessment? And as head of the BGA, the Better Government Association, what would you recommend be done?
Well, that's two good questions. One, it was a very disappointing campaign. Nearly $100 million was spent, and I don't think it shed a lot of light. It shed a lot of heat, unfortunately. But that's the nature of modern campaigns. I think the campaigns have decided that they get the most traction by negative ads that trash the opponent. The debates were very similar, and yes, I would agree that this was not an enlightened campaign and that the public did not get a good picture of the plans and policies of the two candidates. That is unfortunate, but those were the strategies they chose to follow, and at the end of the day, it kept it close for Quinn, and it eventually prevailed for Rauner. What would I do about it? Nothing much anybody can do. The Supreme Court has spoken in Citizens United in several cases after that. They've basically said to the United States of America that you can't really regulate the flow of money very much, or the people who give it and the ones who spend it. As a result, there is no easy formula right now. We are engaged in a couple of policy looks at public financing strategies that might be worth considering, ways to level the playing field a bit. But at the end of the day, maybe it's incumbent upon my old business, the television news business, to provide free time to candidates that don't have a lot of money, or to provide platforms for people to make their cases without having to buy ads. That's not something that television stations tend to want to do. And conversely, my old profession doesn't want to cover serious, quote, dull issues very much, because those are considered things that turn off an audience. So the candidates are guilty, but so is the news media. And at the end of the day, in races across the country, the negative ads were the dominant form of communication. And I don't think there's anything any of us can do to change that, as long as the law allows the flow of money that pay for those ads.
Do you think maybe the citizens, the 13 million citizens, and the third of those registered voters, I guess, who voted, something like that, I think it was, in the gubernatorial election, do you think they sort of got it right? That is, they listened to the negative ads, they listened to the debates, they read the newspapers, they saw what they saw on TV, and their gut was Quinn had 6 years. He hadn't really changed a lot in their view. This is just a guess. in terms of corruption, in terms of patronage, in terms of inefficiency of government. And there was this guy, Rauner, saying, let's do it very differently. And they said, let's give this guy a shot.
Yeah, I think that's essentially what happened. I think at the end of the day, there's been an increasing dissatisfaction with the performance of state government year by year since Blagojevich left, and Pat Quinn was unable to really change those statistics. The unemployment rate has in fact come down. Some of the cuts in facilities and jobs at the state level are probably good work by Pat Quinn. But if you look at the studies one after another on job loss, job creation, economic climate, optimism or pessimism about the future, almost all of the statistics of economic and fiscal performance of a state show that Illinois is in the bottom 5 states in this country. And I think people have been hearing about that for the last 6 years. And as a result, they weren't satisfied that the state was moving in the right direction. Quinn did a really good job of painting a dastardly picture of Bruce Rauner, the businessman, and that, I think, made it as close as it was. And at many points along the way, the polls indicated that Quinn was actually in the lead. But I think the gut check before the election among people is just as you said. It was not much different in Illinois from around the country. The same people who swept the Republicans into the control of the U.S. Senate. There was change in the air. There was anger and dissatisfaction with the status quo, and the party in power is normally going to suffer. That's Pat Quinn, and that was the Senate in all those states. It didn't apply at the House and Senate level in Chicago, and that's largely because of the way the districts are drawn. You really didn't have good choices in most of those races, and most of the voters in those Democratic districts are loyal enough to basically decide to stick with the candidate anyway.
But you noted an important point, and I appreciate you said that because I had kind of neglected it, and it's kind of obvious. It's the economy, stupid. I'm not saying you're stupid. I'm saying that's kind of what people would say. If there's one key thing here, it's that old saying from Bill Clinton in 1992 when people said, what's the issue? He said, it's the economy, stupid. In 2014 in Illinois, is it still the case that it's really the economy? Because Quinn would point out, yes, the unemployment rate has declined significantly while he's been governor, but it's declined throughout the country. Last time I looked, Illinois was still number 36, not starting with the best being number 1, number 36 in 50 states in terms of its unemployment relative to other states.
Well, there's a disconnect with respect to the economy. The stock market's been doing pretty well, and a lot of sectors of the economy are doing well, but I don't think the average American citizen or the average Illinois resident is feeling that good about the economy. This happens in every recession when there are cutbacks and layoffs. People end up working harder for the same amount of money or less, and so the people out there don't feel the benefits of a growing economy. I think there's an unhappiness out there. Incomes have not been rising very well. I think people feel like they're working too hard for too little, and that puts them in sour moods. And when you add to that a state that is defined by so many as dysfunctional in so many ways, you only have one person you can blame for that. It's essentially the governor.
Let's just close with this. Andy Shaw, you're president and the CEO of the Better Government Association. You've been there how many years now?
5.5.
You've built that from, I think when you came there, I think it had 2 people and maybe a budget of $200,000. How many people do you have at the BGA now?
20 full and part-time.
Doing a lot of investigative reporting, essentially, as well as other things?
Doing 5 things: investigate, litigate, educate, advocate, and communicate. And it's gone pretty well because there's so much to do in the city, the county, the suburbs, and the state.
In terms of cleaning up government?
Well, government has to work for the people. Look, better government is our right because these are our tax dollars, and we have every right to expect that the tax dollars will be spent on us, the public, rather than wantonly on public officials. And so we're working for 12.7 million Illinois residents who have a right to expect good government because that's what they're that's what they're giving government their tax dollars to get. And, it's not like if you don't like McDonald's, you can go to Wendy's. If you don't like United Airlines, you can fly American. When it comes to taxes, you don't have a choice. You've got to pay them. And as a result, organizations like ours have to remind public officials every day that they are working for us and not themselves, and that their policies have to serve us and not themselves. And that's why this has been a rewarding 5 years.
And good government doesn't come cheap. As I said, I think you started with a budget about $200,000. You've gone out there and done a good job of raising funds. What are you at now, $3 million budget?
Just under that.
Thank you so much, Andy Shaw, President and CEO of BGA, the Better Government Association. Thanks so much, Andy.
Thanks, Jeff.